Volume.
Previously on Too Many Enemies.
Apparently, Vusi had a set of special skills that allowed him to run the taxi empire.
But those things where there's shootings, where there's burning of taxis, anything, that's taxi violence, that's criminal.
If you can get to the hitman, then of course it's quite hard from an investigative point of view often to close the deal, and of course that to find who was the person behind the murder. And you need, of course, evidence that money was exchanged and evidence that a direct link was made, which is really irrefutable, that can't be disputed.
We start this episode at the Global Investigative Journalism Conference in 2017, held at Wits University in Johannesburg. Journalist and adjunct professor Anton Harber takes the stage.
Carlos Cardosa was born in 1951 in Mozambique.
This is the Carlos Cardosa Memorial Lecture.
Of brave and independent spirit, who was assassinated while investigating corruption.
Before Anton introduces the main speaker, he explains why this assassination of Carlos was so important.
1973, he enrolled at this university, which is one of the reasons we mark him here every year. He studied the humanities, quickly became prominent as a vocal and passionate anti-apartheid and anti-colonial campaigner.
At this point, let's skip forward a few years in Carlos's life.
Indeed, in late 1975, the security police raided his flat in this area, Braamfontein, and arrested him. Within 24 hours, he was deported back to Mozambique.
On his return home, Carlos became a junior reporter on a weekly newspaper called Tempo before joining Radio Mozambique in 1978.
2 years later, he became the director of Mozambique government's news agency, AIM. In 1982, he incurred the wrath of President Samora Machel by running a story on the rebel movement Renamo, bringing the issue into the open for the first time.
For this story, he was jailed for 6 days.
In the late 1980s, he became a vocal advocate of a more independent, robust media, and this led to growing tension between him and the Frelimo government. In 1989, depressed and exhausted, he resigned as director of AIM and, frustrated by the lack of media freedom, dropped out of journalism altogether.
But he only stayed away from journalism for 3 years. In 1992, Mozambique passed media freedom laws that opened up the industry for the first time.
And Cardosa was part of a group of journalists called Media Co-op, who launched the country's first independent publication, Media Fax.
Now, Media Fax was literally a publication that was sent via fax into people's homes every night. It was only 4 pages, but it became an instant success as the only independent media voice in the country at the time.
Although some in the ruling party supported press freedom and were open to the criticism, others responded with harassment and even bomb threats. Cardosa's chief concern at the time was corruption in Mozambique, and he exposed the country's growing drug smuggling syndicates, fraud and embezzlement involving business people and politicians.
His big story involved corruption at the state-controlled Commercial Bank of Mozambique, and it was this investigation that would ultimately lead to his assassination.
On November the 22nd, 2000, Cardosa was gunned down in the streets of Maputo.
2 years later, something extraordinary happened.
Anibal dos Santos, commonly known as Anabalzino, and 5 others were convicted of his murder, receiving long prison sentences and ordered to pay compensation to his family and that of his driver who was injured in the attack.
It was discovered that the assassin who silenced Carlos was hired by 2 members of the same family that had pulled off the multi-million fraud that Carlos was investigating.
As if to confirm that the assassins had friends with influence, the assassin, Anabalzino, escaped from prison 3 times.
Carlos was killed in the year 2000. A passionate, intelligent journalist gunned down in the street. His murder illustrates how the assassination crisis that we've been speaking about in this series isn't confined to South Africa. It is a problem that has escalated in Mozambique since Carlos was killed, and it plagues the African continent.
I knew Carlos as a man with a passion for discussion and argument, always ready to engage energetically, exchange and thrash out ideas all night if necessary. He was fervent in his anti-colonialism and his passion for a free Mozambique. He had an indomitable, independent spirit.
For this episode, we're going to look at assassinations more broadly than just Wandile Bozwana. We're going to reach over into Mozambique and find out the parallels between there and South Africa and how maybe they can all be stopped. Hello, you are listening to Too Many Enemies. I'm Paul McNally. In these 6 episodes, we're going to be looking at the assassination of billionaire Wandile Bozwana and what his murder means for the state of politics, crime, and justice in South Africa today. This is episode 5, and we're heading to Mozambique. We pick up the story with Simone Haysom. How's lockdown in Geneva?
It's pretty relaxed.
Simone lives in Geneva, Switzerland, and is a senior analyst for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime.
I think it was probably one of the easiest places to be locked down. I don't know. Geneva's pretty quiet and boring at the best of times.
Simone is originally from South Africa and has written a number of articles on assassinations in Mozambique.
I research issues of corruption in Mozambique and issues of organized crime, and assassinations are intimately linked to both those things.
Her op-eds on the topic make the case that assassinations are a serious phenomenon in Mozambique, even if it's a relatively small number of people who have been assassinated compared to South Africa.
Really, I think, been quite a disturbing and upsetting place to watch, observe, visit, and come to care about over the last few years.
She says that the democratic space in Mozambique has been declining over a long period of time. And that makes me think of Carlos and him being assassinated back in the year 2000.
Mozambique is ostensibly a democracy, but the same ruling party has been in power for 42 years. That ruling party is largely seen as being synonymous with government.
You could say the same thing about the ruling party in South Africa, the ANC.
It's also an extremely corrupt government. In 2009, the IMF, together with the Mozambican government, issued a report which described Mozambique as being a systematically corrupt country, which is to say a country where corruption is no longer an aberration, but has become the norm.
And this leads us to talking about the assassinations.
Assassinations in Mozambique have so far largely fallen into 2 categories. One category are hits that were associated with a military conflict between the armed wing of Renamo and the government.
This relates to a long-standing feud between the main opposition party and the government.
And then there are a smaller number, but much more symbolic set of assassinations, which have been against lawyers, judges, academics, and journalists. Assassinations and also attempted assassinations, also sort of kidnappings associated with very severe assaults. I would also put those in this category. And they tend to target people who are either trying to enforce the rules or who are very clearly explaining the ways in which rules have been broken and trying to hold people account.
This creates a culture where you can imagine people are afraid to speak out.
Almost the main purpose of an assassination, more even than stopping a particular individual, is to send a message to anyone close to that individual, anyone who looks up to that individual, anyone who would take inspiration from that individual, to send a message to them that they should keep quiet. It's a real fear that people have, and it leads to self-censorship.
Peace deal in 1992 ushered in the post-war period for the country, and this was greeted with a fair amount of optimism.
There was a long-running civil war in Mozambique between the government, which was, as it has been for the last 42 years, run by the ruling party Frelimo, and a military wing and then political entity called Renamo.
And during that time, Renamo became the largest opposition party in the country.
A big move to reconstruct the country, which had been severely damaged by decades of war, and which was followed by also quite high and sustained levels of economic growth.
Then conflict broke out in 2014, and we saw assassinations being used against Renamo members.
And has fairly significant amounts of support in the centre of the country and to a degree in the north.
Since then, an accord has been signed that was meant to see Renamo's military wing dismantled. But that didn't pan out exactly. There's a breakaway Renamo wing that is currently attacking state symbols and civilians.
I think the way that this relates to assassinations is the country was ruled very repressively, and people didn't have safe and legitimate means of criticizing the status quo, of criticizing the way the country was ruled, didn't have outlets for their grievances which could be resolved fairly because of high levels of corruption. So I think, ruling by in a repressive way, potentially through the use of assassinations, is something that's created a huge fragility in Mozambican society.
To dig a bit deeper into the problems of Mozambique, I jump on a call with the executive director of the Center for Democracy and Development, Adriano Novunga.
Part of our work is to defend defenders, so human rights defending in Mozambique. We provide safe housing, we evacuate, and we also enhance the security of defenders in their own context.
So these defenders are people who fight for democracy, journalists, activists, and members of civil society who increasingly are targets for assassinations.
This group of people, they are vulnerable and they need someone to cover their back. We have support to protect those that are at the very, very, very top risk. So those who need to be protected, those who need to be evacuated, etc., those ones, then they have to be immediately supported.
Adriano then gives us an example of what he's talking about.
The most recent assassination is that of human rights defender Anastasio Matavele, who was murdered in Gaza province on the 7th of October 2019 in the context of that problematic, I would say, fraudulent election of last year.
Here is Simon again with more information on the same case.
He was actually leading a training workshop for election monitors in the town of Shai, which is the capital of Gaza province. And he was also the head of the local election observer mission. And it was very likely that his murder was linked to a voter registration scandal that preceded the last general elections in Mozambique, where the attackers, when they sped away, actually crashed their car. And for that reason, a number of them were arrested, and it was revealed that they were police officers.
Here is Adriano again.
Anastasio Matavel was a great man, a great defender, but he was a national figure, and he was someone who was not perceived as a risk for the establishment. He was a moderate commentator, so he had moderate views in terms of governance, but unfortunately, they decided to target him.
Here is Simon giving a quick summary of what happened to all the killers.
The killers fled, they crashed. 2 of them died in the car crash. 2 were lightly injured and arrested, and 1 fled. He's actually believed to have fled to South Africa and is still on the run. The 2 that were arrested were put on trial, along with 4 other people and another civilian. So I think in total 6 policemen were put on trial. And they were quite recently sentenced to quite heavy sentences, I think between 6 and 24 years, which, is a form of accountability. It's a good thing that trial happened. It's a good thing that those people were brought to justice. The motivation for the assassination, however, was never revealed, and the investigations never went further up the chain or ever explained why these policemen would conspire to murder an election observer.
There were convictions, but only for those who were hired as hitmen, not those who ordered the hit.
And that's something, one unfortunately sees often. Also in South Africa recently, we've seen a lot of people who pulled the trigger be arrested, but the sort of grander conspiracy behind those murders have not been revealed.
Here is Adriano again.
The trial of those who assassinated him did not reveal the real motive for his assassination, as the masterminders were not taken to the dock. Only those who have executed the killing were the ones. So, and they were soldiers, and soldiers, they take orders. They don't ask what the reason is for that particular order. So from the trial of these people, we were not able to ascertain the reasons behind his killing.
Adriano was not happy with the result.
Those who assassinated him were indeed convicted, but we were not happy with the outcome of the trial. On the one hand, we wanted the state, the Mozambican state, also to be in the dock, because these people who assassinated him, they were wearing state uniforms, they were using state insignias, they were also using state military equipment to execute these men, and they were in a normal working schedule. So we thought that was enough to also indict the state as being complicit.
Adriano wants to stress how important this murder has been for the country.
So this is one of the most emblematic assassinations, which not only assassinated Matavel, but also it set a juncture for democratic closure and the thinking of the civic and democratic space here in Mozambique.
Do you feel that because of the work you do that you're in any kind of danger?
Well, for a number of occasions, I was threatened, life-threatening messages, being chased in the road, but you have to keep focused and do what you believe is the right thing to be done.
This process of guessing who is the next likely target and thus preventing an assassination is difficult.
Most of them, they think they will stand, they will stay, but we are there to say, listen, once in a while you need to move away so that, you let things cool down, then you will come back. So it is this kind of engagements that we have with defenders in a regular basis.
Here is Simon again.
We have recorded at least 23 assassinations or assassination attempts since 2014. And they largely fall into these two categories. One's related to the military conflict and one aimed at civil society. In South Africa, there are a very diverse range of motivations behind the assassinations. And there's also a very large, for want of a better word, assassination industry. So there are a lot of hitmen for hire, quite literally. The structure of the industry in Mozambique is much less clear. It's quite likely that even when assassinations are motivated by political aims, that people might, for instance, make arrangements with figures within the organized crime world in Mozambique to undertake those assassinations, or they might use state employees, police perhaps, or military members.
She draws a comparison with South Africa.
In South Africa, the picture is more mixed, but there are also huge problems of impunity. So if I were to say the two things that were in common between the two sort of assassination phenomena, it would be the use of assassinations as a message and this very unfortunate reality that a lot of them happen without any real investigation or consequences.
Here is Adriano again.
I have seen judges being shot dead when they deny being bribed. I have also seen civil society activists being shot, like Matavel, for defending a particular cause. I've seen journalists being murdered for exposing corruption and illicit economic activities. There is an area linked to networks of drug trafficking that is clearly a no-go area. The more you know about those networks, the more you know about those corridors, the likely to be shot.
And then lastly, how did you get into this work? What is your background and how did you find yourself in a position like this?
That's a good one. This comes from my childhood. When I was raised, I had a group of colleagues at the primary school, and then we, at the secondary school, each of us went to its own direction. When I returned to the community where I was born and raised and bred, I was shocked to find that almost all of my former classmates from the primary school and secondary school, they had died. They died of diseases that they have medicine. Some of them died of HIV. Some of them died by lack of support at the community. And then I started to understand the suffering of those people. Inspired me to try to understand the causes for that. Why is it possible that in the socialist era, in the first 2 decades of Mozambique's independence, people, they were supported. The state was there. It was short, but the state was there supporting the people. After that, the state was no longer there to support the people, was no longer there to provide anything for the people. Then you understand that corruption, you understand that bad governance, bad leadership are the root causes of the suffering for the people.
Simone also reflects on the state of Mozambique in this moment.
It's an incredibly difficult moment for Mozambique right now, with a high level of conflict and a very sort of corrupt government that it's hard to get accountability out of. And as the manipulations around the last general election showed, it's currently really an uphill battle to get a political shift through opposition politics. So there's a huge need for there to be pressure, internal or external, or a combination that forces the political elite to make accountability work. And there is already the basis for that. I meet very many extremely brave people in Mozambique. They're extremely brave journalists. They're extremely brave activists in civil society that are trying to do that organizing work, that are trying to do the work investigating and putting information out there. You also meet people within government who really want to do their jobs, particularly in the criminal justice system, who would love to be able to enforce the rules without political interference. And if repressive forces were to lift, I think there could be enormous progress around accountability in Mozambique.
Next time on Too Many Enemies, we're going to return to the case of the assassination of billionaire Wandile Bozwana. We're going to pick up on a very important part of the story that involves a R1 million payoff, a government minister, and the bank account of a famous DJ. This is all in the final episode of Too Many Enemies. You've been listening to Too Many Enemies. This podcast series has been produced by me, Paul McNally, and podcasting company Volume. It's brought to you by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime in partnership with News 24. You can find out more about the Global Initiative by visiting globalinitiative.net. That's globalinitiative.net. We would also like to acknowledge Supersport, the author of the advertisement heard in this episode. The advert was originally posted on YouTube on the 24th of April, 2015. The music for this series was composed by Aman Mori. This episode was mixed and mastered by Gwynch Sarame and Richard Rumney. Join me next time for the 6th episode in this series of Too Many Enemies. Goodbye. Next time on Too Many Enemies.
It's time. Two legends. One destiny. All roads end here. Mayweather-Pacquiao.
Volume.